Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our new strategic webinar on aviation impact on non-CO₂ emission. My name is Marilyn Bastin, and I'm the head of aviation sustainability in EUROCONTROL. I would like to thank you for joining us today, and I do hope we will answer to some of your questions or issues you may have on non-CO₂ emission. This 8th strategic webinar aims to explore the non-CO₂ climate impact of flying, focusing primarily on contrail, cirrus cloud, and the emission of the nitrogen oxide, also called NOx, and how we could reduce them. Last November, a publication from the European Commission on the aviation impact on climate change suggests that 2/3 of aviation emission comes from non-CO₂ emission, mostly contrails. Recent studies have shown that this non-CO₂ effect could be reduced substantially if the air traffic management community takes coordinated action. On the operational front, MUAC, Maastricht Upper Area Control Center, in partnership with DLR, the German Aerospace Center, has launched some trials about contrail prevention, the first of its kind. But what is the current understanding of the main climate impact of this non-CO₂ emission? How can the aviation industry best address this non-CO₂ emission? What has been already done on the operational side? What are the key challenges from both a technological and operational side to mitigate this non-CO₂ effect? And finally, what other measures could be taken to reduce and to mitigate this impact? During this webinar with our panelists, and thanks to your active contribution, we will try to answer to those questions. And at the end of this webinar, we do hope that you will have a better understanding of the complexity of the non-CO₂ emission, that the ATM industry community has been working on this matter for many years and is still working on it to find some solution. I'm quite happy today because I have a quite impressive panel. Our 3 panelists are main experts and they are working on this matter for many years. And it's my pleasure to introduce you Professor Dr. Robert Southern, who has been working on climate modeling for about 4 decades. And since 1991, he has been leading the Department of Earth System Modeling for the DLR Institute of Atmospheric Physics. Then it's my pleasure to introduce you Rüdiger Hermantraut, who has been working for EUROCONTROL since 1996. He has started his career at the Experimental Center at Bretigny in France, and then he has been working for MUAC at different positions, and he is now the senior project leader on this avoidance of contrail project at MUAC. And finally, I would like to introduce Mrs. Olivia Nunez, who has been working in the air traffic management for at least 30 years. She has been working for 20 years as an air traffic controller and a supervisor for the en route and TMA, and then she became an operational expert for the CSAR joint undertaking. And now I'm sure that you are impatient to listen to our first panelist. So I would like to give the floor to Professor Robert Southern.
Okay, so I would like to talk a little bit on aviation non-CO₂. You all know that aviation impacts climate by emission of CO₂, which changes the composition of the atmosphere, and it finally is a climate gas, which is a climate forcer. Similar is the second reaction product of burning kerosene. This is water vapor. This works the same way. However, aircraft emit also many other substances, for instance, like NOx or carbon monoxide or unburnt volatile organic compounds, sulfur and particles and so on. All these have impacts on the climate in various ways, as you can see in this simplified plot. And there's, of course, one most prominent one, that is contrails, which are created by water vapor emitted by the aircraft, and which are modified by particles also emitted by the aircraft. In a way of summarizing this is by looking at tables like this, the effective radiative forcing, which is a kind of measure what will happen to the climate if it comes to new equilibrium on the long term, as the effective radiative force is somewhat proportional to the new equilibrium temperature. And as you can see on the panel, the most important part is from the contrails and contrail cirrus, and then we have carbon dioxide, and then we have several effects coming from NOx, and we have aerosol effects, and we have something which we do not know so much about, as are the indirect aerosol effects. In total, as you already heard, the non-CO₂ effects sum up to something like 2/3 of the total aviation radiative forcing. And the non-CO₂ effects would also occur if you use alternative fuels, in particular also if you burn or in a combustion chamber or in a fuel cell hydrogen. And something which also particular for the aviation non-CO₂ effects, that their magnitude, the magnitude of the associated forcing, strongly depends on the location of the emission and of the time of the emission. Then, having this in mind, we would like to ask, how can we mitigate the impact of aviation? So the first which comes into mind is you have to reduce the specific emissions. So, for instance, by going to alternative fuels, by using hydrogen-powered aircraft and so on. But at the end, you would have to reduce the absolute emissions. And you can do something more. You can optimize aircraft, for instance, for lower altitudes, for lower Mach numbers and so on. And you can do eco-efficient flight trajectories, which would require an adaptive ATM. If you want to do this, you can eco-efficient flight trajectories. This opens you a pathway to account for the non-CO₂ effects better than some of the very simplified suggestions that you simply multiply the CO₂ emissions by a constant factor, which gives you the wrong incentives for the aviation industry to achieve the best. So instead, you should prefer to fly at locations and altitudes where the climate impact is particularly low. This is illustrated by these two diagrams, where you have two different weather situations. You have in darker and lighter brownish colors, you see high and smaller impacts. Traditionally, you would fly, for instance, like a great circle or following the most strongest tailwinds, and you would fly on the red line, for instance. But if you have adapted flight, you would fly, for instance, the green way, where you have a smaller impact on the climate. The question is, how would this work? And this is illustrated in that way, where you see in this diagram on the horizontal axis the change in climate impacts, on the vertical axis the change in fuel burn. You also could put total operational costs on the vertical axis. And what you see here, you can achieve quite a lot, up to 50% and even more of climate change for only 1 or 2% of additional fuel burn. So it's a way to do this. And that is what we are trying to currently together with MUAC. And eventually we would like to demonstrate this method more extensively in a German LUFO project, where also MUAC participates as an associated partner. And this brings me to the end of my short presentation. I will give you a kind of summary. What you have learned: aviation significantly contributes to global warming, and the aviation share has been growing until COVID-19, and but this is exceptionally. And the non-CO₂ effects of aviation are particularly large. They are larger than in many other industrial sectors. And if you compare the non-CO₂ effects with the CO₂ effects, you need to properly suitable methods to do this. And we need to know that in the few recent years, the knowledge about the non-CO₂ effects has increased substantially in the recent years. From the non-CO₂ effects, some are warming, some are cooling. And there remains a high uncertainty with respect to the indirect aerosol effects. But nevertheless, this is not sufficient not to act. A part of uncertainty is, for instance, to the everyday weather variability, and you can already act right now. And as the lifetime of the non-CO₂ effect is shorter than CO₂ effect, but the forcing is larger, and you can mitigate the aviation effects by reduction of specific emissions, by alternative fuel, and by eco-efficient flight trajectories. And the special case of this is avoiding controls or persistent controls, as we will hear more about this in the course of this presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Robert, for this very interesting presentation. We just learned that by playing on climate trajectory, we can try to mitigate this non-CO₂ emission, meaning contrails, and it gives the perfect floor for Rüdiger to explain the live trials at MUAC. So please, Rüdiger, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. As Marilyn already said, my name is Dr. Rüdiger Ermantraut. I'm German project manager. I'm a father of a daughter and a son, and working at Maastricht UAC as a project manager. I'm leading this contrail prevention project that we are running. Just a second. As Robert said, with 2/3 of aviation's climate change impact believed to come from aircraft non-CO₂ emissions, prevention of contrails has a key role to play in the mitigation of climate impact of aviation. Maastricht UAC is conducting a live contrail prevention trial in 2021. This contrail prevention trial is the first of its kind in the world and will investigate the operational feasibility of contrail prevention by ATC and evaluate its impact. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay.
Oh, sorry, I should have. So what is or who is Maastricht Upper Area Control? I've gathered some slides. You see the airspace. We are operating airspace for the Netherlands, Belgium, and parts of northern Germany and Luxembourg. And Maastricht is located in that little spot where the arrow points to. We're employing about 700 people, from which about 300 are operational. And there are also lots of, we do our own training, engineering, administration, and other stuff. We have the specificity to operate cross-border airspace for the 4 states. And we also have the specificity to operate military operations for Germany and the Netherlands. And militaries are parts of our complexity as well. With the contrail prevention trial, it is assessing how to avoid environmental warming caused by persistent contrails with eco-efficient flight trajectories in live operations. NEOC is examining relatively minor operational measures, such as diverting aircraft 2,000 feet up or down from their normal flight path in order to reduce persistent contrail formation and contrail cirrus. This requires the creation of a contrail prediction system, the implementation of, and that is, no, another slide, excuse me, I jumped this one. We are doing that trial, and it's a big opportunity. At the moment, our world is suffering from the low traffic caused by the COVID crisis, but for such a trial that we are running, it is an opportunity. We know that the air aviation industry has to come back. When it comes back, we will encounter the environmental impact. So we're taking this traffic downturn as an opportunity, and we will be ready then also with additional procedures to normal traffic levels when necessary. There is the different difficulties, of course, are the contrail prevention. The high supersaturation regions must be prevented. There's issues on the predictability of that. We will adapt our working processes, and we will evaluate the environmental benefit. We hear from our airlines the feedback that there is a problematic of CO2 emission charges because typically, these control prevention measures add CO2 fuel burn, and the airlines have to pay CO2 taxes. Now, the prediction, as I said, is an issue. At the moment, we try to predict supersaturated regions from which we deviate the aircraft then vertically only. And that prediction is an issue today. We are validating that system, and but we see that there are issues. Definitely more work to be invested in here. And then we are doing tactical air traffic control. Air traffic control is happening now in this moment. And our control prevention is also something which is not based on planning, it is happening now. Therefore, we would possibly prefer an ISSR observation system instead of a predictive system. Now, can that be achieved? That's a big question mark. We have just started the trial. We are now 12 weeks into the trial. We run it every other day. That is a request by DLR for a cleaner statistical evaluation of the results. We must, certainly what we can already say today is that ISSR prediction must be improved. We learn that, and we are improving our operational decision-making processes, and we continue the validation with the DLR, which is based on satellite images. Now, what's next? Traffic will come back, hopefully, soon. Then we will try to operate the same procedures even under high traffic levels. That will be a challenge. Then we will further tune and validate the ISSR prediction system. And we are looking into alternatives and especially into real-time online ISSR detection. That's all that I can say today. I hope it gave a little insight, and I also hope that towards the end of this year, we will come back with real results and tangible outputs. And with this, I hand over back to you, Marilyn.
Thank you, Rüdiger. It was perfect. I know that in 5 minutes, it's really not easy to summarize the activities at MUAC live trials, but I do hope that it helps the audience to better understand what you are doing and what still needs to be done. And now I would like to give the floor to Olivia for the CSAR joint undertaking works. Please, Olivia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marilyn. A bit of an introduction. So I work for the CSAR joint undertaking. We are the coordinating agency that's coordinating the CSAR research program. And just as a bit of an introduction, this is what we call the technological pillar of the Single European Sky. So the research in CSAR is based on the plan that's made for the Single European Sky in the European ATM Master Plan. And we've had successive updates. This has been ongoing since the year 2008. And the latest planning document we have is the Strategic Research and Innovation Agenda. And in there we have our roadmaps. Roadmap 7 is dedicated to the Aviation Green Deal. And, this is the CSAR program covers the whole life cycle from the early exploratory research where you have, ideas that are maybe just an idea, just a first view. And then the CSAR program is bringing people together, first universities, first theory, then goes more into practice, more into applications, and then all the way into demonstrations to actually put things into operation. And we've had already some exploratory research looking into the non-CO₂ impacts. Like Marilyn was saying, this has been ongoing for a number of years. And we have also brought this into CSAR, and is now part of the overall vision of the Aviation Green Deal in CSAR, so that we're no longer just looking to the CO₂ as was the case before. And even though I know it's not the focus today, but I think it's important to say we have two areas, let's say, of interest. One area is the airport, and the other area, which is our focus today, is the en route. So for the airport, we already have had, for many years, the problem that we know of the noise and the neighboring communities. We're talking here of the quality of life of the people that live around the airport. And, local air quality is also really important for this. And, in some cases, it's not just the people. We have wildlife habitat that needs to be preserved. And there is also, in the case of this low-level impact, there is also a trade-off. And this has been, known and applied for many years. If you like, you have the noise abatement departure procedures that have been in operation, I think, for almost 20 years. And, you have a choice. You climb faster, then you're using, more fuel, but you rapidly leave the low-level area around the airport. And that means potentially less noise. I say potentially because there are more items in play, and improve local air quality. This is just part of the story. You can also consider which way whether you are your departure routes go to one place or the other. You can actually have a much more refined analysis, and this is what we've been looking into. So our projects are looking at developing some environmental change functions that are actually trying to collect, in some metrics that are understandable and transparent, all these impacts, so that, potentially in the future, we can look at having noise abatement departure procedures that are tailored to the local conditions, the specific wind and the atmosphere on the day. And that would be in that way minimizing the impact on the communities. And at the same time, considering as well the overall impact on climate. So looking at the emissions in particular, in this case, the CO2 and for the local air quality. Then I'll just going on to our focus today, which is actually the en route and the contrails or the aviation induced cloudiness. Just to say there are lots of uncertainties. I won't elaborate more on that because this is really not my domain. I'm an air traffic management expert, but we do know that that air traffic management has to play a very important role here, because unlike with CO2 emissions, in this case, where emissions are released into the atmosphere really makes a difference. And that is where traffic management can make a big difference. So the complexity of the subject lies in what Robert and Rudiger were explaining before. To start with, the aviation-induced cloudiness is not always bad, if you like. So we know it's not always warming. Contrails are not even the whole story. Maybe they get the name because you see them more, but it's not the whole story. And we need to decide on which metrics to use. We have a choice of metrics, and in particular, look ahead time. When we look at the impact on climate, as was said before, if you look in the shorter term, then the forcing of the non-CO2 emissions is higher. And if you look in the longer term, then maybe CO2 becomes, let's say, more important. But if you have this high effect, even if it's short term, but it's permanent on the atmosphere, it's also going to have this big effect overall on the climate. And therefore, in the end, we will need to make a choice of what is the reasonable look ahead time to optimize against. Excuse me, then just to further complicate things, I think it's important to realize that sometimes it's not a simple story like with CO2, in the sense that if you have two aircraft, that means twice the emissions, and at the same time, that means twice the impact. So in the case of contrails or non-CO2, sometimes there can be a chain effect, so triggered by a single aircraft, that triggers this effect, and then the clouds start forming. Even if you don't have and more aircraft coming afterwards. Then what's clear is that there a lot of progress has been made, but there's still a lot more to learn. So more research is needed. We know that there's a need to continue the research, but just because we know we do not know everything doesn't mean we cannot do something now. And this is, in some cases, we already know that the effects are really important. These are, have been referred to in the non-CO₂ report that Marilyn was referring to earlier as the big hits. And in these cases, we would like to start acting now as soon as possible. Excuse me. We have had some very encouraging data about what the potential can be. This is data from a sample of over 10,000 flights that were intra-ICAC flights in a day in December 2015, and they were using a metric of the effect on the temperature 20 years from now, and they got that actually with a relatively low increase in fuel burn and CO₂, like 1%, you could already decrease the impact on the climate by 60%. I think this was a very, very, at least for me, shocking finding. That's telling us, well, we actually need to pursue this as soon as we can, because 60% is just really something that is worth pursuing. So where to start? The view we have is to build on the same approach that Maastricht trials are taking, but trying to incorporate some element in the planning. So we don't want to talk anymore, let's say, about specifically contrail avoidance. We would be looking at something that can incorporate potentially now what we know better, maybe now contrails, and later on it can incorporate more, something that we would call the eco areas that need to be avoided for environmental reasons. We are very dependent on having a good Met service that can provide some predictions, maybe ideally 6 hours ahead, maybe a shorter look ahead time would also be possible. And we envision this being managed similarly to the way that we manage other areas to avoid today. We have experience on this in air traffic management. So for instance, just as an example, we have the Delta military areas that need to be avoided. And, if you have published these areas that need to be avoided, aircraft would be able to flight plan around them like they would do today with another type of restricted area. But it's clear that air traffic control will need to support this in real time. And this avoidance, it needs to be supported in real time in two ways. One is just the start. The flight plan is only the start of a good trajectory, but for tactical reasons, the flight plan cannot always be exactly followed. And it's important that air traffic control knows when an altitude has been planned because of environmental reasons. It's not just that was the altitude that was maybe not the best one. And then secondly, because it is hopefully this is going to be combined with some real-time monitoring. And so if the prediction, let's say, is not confirmed, then we should be able to release these eco areas so that aircraft can fly. And in this way, we are minimizing the deviation to strictly when we are sure that the effect is negative. And then what we know is that eventually this is all dependent on prediction and on data. So we'll probably need to strengthen the downlink of humidity data, which is part of the story only, but it's maybe it's not the most common data to be downlinked today from aircraft, and it would be needed. From our perspective, it's really important to be transparent. So this is part of the overall concept of the environmental performance dashboards that would be showing the transparency over what has been done and why it has been done, and the positive impact we're having on the atmosphere. And that's all on my side as an introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olivia. It's perfect. It's good to know that we are not working only in the en route phase, but also at the airport level. So I think it's quite important to mention and to have a better view of where we are now regarding this non-CO2 emission. And now I would like to start the question and answer session because we have more than 300 people that are connected and I see a lot of questions that are put in the chat. So I will try to do it in a fair way. I will take some questions that have been sent in advance and I will also take some questions directly from the chat. So I will start with a first question coming that has been sent in advance from Mr. William McMaster from Aegis. In your opinion, should the industry be focusing as much on non-CO2 emission as CO2 emission? So I think it's a good question. So what do we have to do now? Because we know that we have this non-CO2 emission, we have the CO2 emission decrease pressure coming from the Green Deal. So what do we do? Olivia, do you have something to say about this?
But just from our perspective, yes, I can say that clearly, you know, the regulation today and the focus is on CO2 because there is the uncertainty we have regarding the non-CO2. So yes, the basis today is the CO2, but we want to work towards this avoiding at least the big hits. So and we envision in CSAR as an R&D program that we will know more, and as we know more, we in the end what we want is to take into account the impact on climate wherever it comes from.
Okay, thank you, Olivia. I see another question from the chat about the use of biofuel. So would biofuel reduce contrail formation? If so, can we estimate the reduction? Robert, please, you mentioned this in your presentation, so maybe you can complement.
Biofuels are in principle quite similar, at least in the emissions with respect to conventional kerosene, with one difference. So the water vapor is about the same, so you will form the same amount of contrails. However, biofuels will create less soot due to the construction or the composition of the fuel. Less soot in the fuel means that the contrails, the long-lasting contrails, become radiatively less efficient. So you can reduce part of the contrail effect by using biofuels. That's the good news. The bad news is that this is a non-linear effect. If you, for instance, reduce the soot by something like 80%, you only reduce the radiative effect only by 50%. That's bad news about this. Yeah. But it would be a step forward.
Okay, thank you, Robert. I'm going to ask another question coming from the chat. And I think it will be for Rüdiger, so please listen carefully because the question is long. How do you see these eco-friendly trajectories being implemented? There are a lot of operational, business and regulatory implications for INSP airlines and network manager, amongst other stakeholders. So yes, how could we do this?
Long question, short answer, by giving a climb to or a descent to clearance. That is what we are doing. We are not in the regulation part. We are not trying, absolutely not trying to regulate airspace. We don't regulate airspace due to contrail or presence of ice supersaturation. We keep the airspace, we block the airspace, but it is open for safety, of course. If needed, we take the airspace. And otherwise, we very, very simple, we give a climb and a descent clearance. Hopefully not more than 2,000 feet, and that's all that we do.
Yeah, but Rüdiger, I think that the question behind was more, how do you take into account some airlines, for instance, decision, because maybe they don't agree, you know, to fly a climate trajectory, meaning more fuel burn, and it goes against their own requirements. So how do you deal with this kind of, you know, opposite specification?
I think in your question, there are two parts in it. One is the airline operators. And for good reasons, they say we are possibly eventually burning more fuel. That is not always the case, because even today it is rare that you're on a true optimal profile in our crowded airspace. You are already deviated from your optimal profile just because of airspace complexity, saturation. So, and we think the difference between additional contrail prevention and that, anyhow, the non-optimality of our current system is not so big. But yet, airlines have a point here. And also environmentally spoken, burning more CO2 is, of course, has also a counter effect. So we should really, really avoid burning additional fuel. And that also gives very high requirements on our system, on the predictability of this, of the ice supersaturation, on the minimization and the surgical way that we deal with the contrail prevention. That is really, really important.
Yeah, thank you, Rüdiger. And now I will take another question that has been sent in advance from Luis Escobar from the CES unit within DG Move. So in your opinion, what is the role that European legislator and policymakers should play in this field? Maybe Robert.
Yeah, Maya, I can answer this also. Yeah. Might help to solve quite a few questions. If you want airlines to follow eco-efficient flight trajectory, however they are created, there need to be incentives for doing this. Or if you do not want to force them on a particular, very particular route, this might be the better way to do it by incentives. One way might be including the non-CO₂ effects into the European emission trading system by calculating the non-CO₂ effects into eco-efficient, into CO₂ equivalents, as has been done in this one diagram, which I showed you in slides 3 or 4. And if you do this, you find out that, say, if you have a price for CO₂ equivalent, something more than 10 or 15 euros per ton, the airline normally would do everything to go along to minimal climate impact, because it pays off for them.
Thank you. Indeed, it's an interesting proposal, an incentive via the ETS scheme, quite interesting. I don't know if Olivia would like to comment on this via the CSAR joint undertakings perspective.
Yes, thank you, Marilyn. Just from our perspective, just to say that the technical possibilities are many, and what we try to do from our point of view is to encourage research to showcase the possibilities that exist, and in the end, the technical design has to be driven by a policy decision. Then at this stage, maybe from our perspective, to say that also after the non-CO₂ report has come out, it's become clear that this is going to be paramount in terms of limiting the impact of aviation on the environment, which is a societal demand. And what's maybe at this stage, before thinking of the implementation, we also need to plan how we're going to go about finding the best way forward and coordinate. There is a lot of work that's needed in terms of research and coordination to find the best way forward, so that we can provide evidence, because in the end, this is what we need in order to be able to implement these concepts. We need evidence and more knowledge.
Thank you, Olivia. I will take another question from the chat. Is it possible to measure the effect of contrail avoidance by one aircraft, or is it just estimation at this stage? Rüdiger, maybe you can answer, or Robert? Maybe Robert, yes.
Yeah, and actually, as we know the individual aircraft, we can associate the contrails, which this has formed a persistent contrail. We can really say at this stage, this aircraft did not form a contrail which it would have formed if it was not have been deviated. At the current stage, we do not do this in terms of radiative forcing. We just do the one step prior. Can we avoid producing persistent contrast at all. And that's we hope to demonstrate in by satellite observations of the flights. And from MUAC, we know, of course, where the aircraft has been flying.
Thank you, Robert. I will take also another question that has been sent in advance because it's also answer to some of the questions that have been put in the chat. But where are we in terms of metrics? So it's a question from Gregor Tam from DFS. Climate protection is more than saving CO2. However, the climate debate is focusing very intensively on saving CO2. When we will be able to pursue an integrated approach that considers CO2, other emission and warming, cooling effect from contrails. So Olivia, do you want to comment on this?
Maybe to say our projects so far have used the ATR, the average temperature response, in 20 years and 100 years. And we think that this is actually intuitively a very good metric because it's giving you, the effect of all this rather than, even more so than the kilos of CO2 that we are used to. However, eventually we understand this is part of an overall approach for aviation and maybe for other transport modes. So maybe it will be necessary to come to an agreement of what is the best metric for everybody so that we can talk to each other.
Yeah, thank you. I will ask another question to Rüdiger because it's about the MUAC trials. MUAC operates tactical contrail prevention, that means decision in real time. Other projects and efforts are about flight planning to avoid contrail. Why did MUAC choose the tactical approach, and what would that mean that the alternative with pre-tactical planning is wrong?
That is a good question. Maybe I will try to answer this way. If we had a perfect meteo weather prediction system, a perfect system which perfectly well detects and predicts where ice supersaturation is and therefore where contrails can be avoided, then we can go towards flight planning. Even there I would make an exception. But it is clear if we can predict very well, then we could also plan the flights in a way that they avoid these areas. That is the logic. That is also the logic that Olivia mentioned before with these echo areas. However, there are 2 points that you have to see here. The first point is that weather prediction system is not existing, which is an important point. And the other point is a generic thing, which is that we already mentioned a little bit earlier, which is planability of flight paths against ATC. ATC in general is disturbing flight planning. We try our best. It is one of our objectives, the expeditious flow of traffic. But of course, if aircraft gets crowded, the flight plans are an indication. And therefore, I think our approach, certainly for high density and high levels of ATC, is a good one. We hope to achieve much higher accuracy and therefore have the better system. Now, that is true for the dense areas of the world, but there are many remote areas with also low ATC levels or just procedural ATC. And here, of course, actually the same is true. Flight planning is a solution for these areas, but if there was a high precision real-time system telling pilots to circumnavigate or to fly under or above ice supersaturation, that again, in my opinion, would be better. Yeah? So in general, I would always favor the tactical system against the pre-tactical system.
Thank you, Rüdiger. I think it's quite clear. I see a question in the chat that has a lot of success, so I'm going to ask it. Again, it's a long question, and I think it will be for Robert. So water is a major contributor to climate change. However, the current trend is to talk about hydrogen combustion of fuel cells, which would greatly increase H2O emissions. Is this being taken into account, or is it known that the effect of this new technology will be minor? If so, how do you know? Thanks. So it's a quite intensive question, but I think that it's quite interesting because indeed we are speaking a lot about hydrogen for the future of the aviation sector. So what will be the impact of this new technology on non-CO₂? Robert, please.
Yeah, that's a good shot. Let me try to answer this. It's currently the impact of hydrogen powered aircraft is a big question in research. The first thing is correct. If you run such an aircraft for the same amount of energy needed to fly the aircraft, you emit more water vapor. If you emit more water vapor, you produce more contrails. That's simply. You avoid, if you fly by fuel cell powered hydrogen aircraft, you avoid all other non-CO₂ effects apart from the things which go with respect to water vapor. We know that there will be more contrails. What we do not know is how radiatively effective are they, because so far nobody measured a contrail from a hydrogen-powered aircraft or fuel cell-powered aircraft. We made some preliminary studies some 10 or 15 years ago in the context of the old European Union cryoplane project, and there it turned out that on the long term, say 20 years or so, when the CO₂ is gone from the traditional aircraft, this way would be better. But in order to, we had to make some assumptions on the size of the particle, because such an aircraft will not emit cloud condensation nuclei. The particles will be larger in the contrails, and they will sink more rapidly and dissolve more rapidly. So in this numerical study turned out that this is also is with respect to radiative forcing is better. But actually, we need to know are these initial conditions which we assume for this controls of hydrogen-powered aircraft correct, or are they wrong, which can only be proved by a measurement.
Thank you. Olivia, I don't know if you want to complement from a CSAR point of view. Did you look at this hydrogen and non-CO₂ relation?
Yes, thank you, Marilyn. Well, it's actually in our to-do list, let's say. In all our models right now are taking into account existing aircraft types that are flying today. But we have definitely flagged the need to learn about what's going to happen with hydrogen aircraft and whatever comes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I'm reading at the same time the chat, so it's not so easy. I see another question that has a lot of success, and I think that again it will be for Robert. You said that the radiative forcing factor of non-CO₂ emission is roughly 2/3 of the aviation emission. If you consider that the total effect, including the endurance of these emissions, the fact that it's short-lived for the non-CO₂ compared to CO₂, which is long-lived for 100 years, what would be the share of the non-CO₂ emission of the total climate impact?
That depends what you do, whether you look for pulse emissions or for sustained emissions. And if you look you have also, because there is two kinds of memories in this. The one kind of memory is how long does the effect stay in the atmosphere? And the second effect, how long does the climate system remember what has been done? It's simply like when you have cooking a pot of water on an oven. If you stop boiling, the oven still stays warm, and also the water still stays warm because the energy is already in. The same is here with the ocean. And the metric ATR, which has been mentioned several times before, takes account of this. And so this, and then you can get a more measure what is happening the next, say, several decades. And in this way, considering the non-CO₂ effects helps us to meet the phase until carbon neutral, total carbon neutral world, whichever will happen during this century, and it makes it easier to stay below a given threshold. May it be 1.5 or maybe 2 degrees or whatever might be thought about this. Therefore, it's necessary to do this now, because you can do this more rapidly than you can get more new aircraft with new engines into power, which will take at least 2 decades until you have them in a reasonable amount of them available. While this kind of ATM measures, you can do it in order of 5 to 10 years, depending how fast policy decisions are made.
Thank you, Robert. I see another question from Rüdiger in the chat. Which issue did you discover in the operational room during the first week of trial? Do you have some story to share or some findings to share about what happened during this first week of trial?
Oh, the normal things. Not everybody. We are running an operational trial, which means our air traffic controllers are supposed to implement it. These things. So, and then we have, like with all humans, we are in a human system. And so we have all kinds of reactions from our air traffic controllers. And these are between just not having been aware enough about it, or haven't been briefed, but already forgotten the briefing, these normal things. But we are improving on that. And of course, you have to see that we are basically doing night trials or late afternoon trials, and our traffic is extremely low. Also, we had not such weather, together with Robert and his team, we're now every other evening watching the meteo forecast and interpreting that. And we had very cold weather here in this part of Europe, which means these ISSR were very low and not really in the flight levels where they could produce contrails. We had that very often in the starting of the year. So, which is at the moment, we did not give so many clearances actually. And that in return means that the return from the ops room is not very important at the moment. But we are doing questionnaires and we try to get feedback. And so we are definitely working and looking for higher traffic. And now the last days, meteo gets warmer and also the ISSR goes into our flight levels. So we get more contrail prevention the last weeks.
Thank you, Rüdiger. I'm very sorry because we are almost at the end of our session. So I will not be able to tackle all the questions that have been sent into the chat, but I really thank you for participating so much. But before I conclude this webinar, I would like to give the floor to our panelists for a final word, their main takeaway from this session, or a final message to share with us. So I will start with Robert. Robert, do you have a final word to say?
Yes, I think we should take the opportunity to go along eco-efficient flight trajectories, which we started as a very beginning phase, and because this opens the aviation industry and the airlines a way of reducing their climate impacts at rather low costs, and substantially reducing the climate impact at rather low cost.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Rüdiger, please, a final word.
I think what we are doing at the moment is really like getting the low-hanging fruit, as somebody else said, and that is important. We can do something already today. That is the message. So every clearance counts. That's what we do at Maastricht.
Thank you, Rüdiger. And Olivia, your turn.
Thank you, Marilyn. So from my side, maybe to say that it's exciting times ahead. So being able to reduce the climate impact of aviation is, by the percentages we're talking about, is really exciting. And from our point of view, it's just also great to see that Europe is leading here, because we are really ahead like Rudiger was saying, they're doing the first trials that we know in the world, and we are actually proposing to do things that have never been done before. And that's always exciting from our R&D point of view.
Yeah, thank you, Olivia. And now I would like to conclude this webinar. So thanks to our 3 panelists, we have now a better overview of the non-CO₂ emission, including contrails, contrail cirrus clouds, and NOx. We also learn how MUAC is assessing the operational feasibility to avoid contrails by the air traffic control. We also learn about what CSAR is doing in terms of non-CO₂ emission research at airport level, but also at the en route level. We discuss also 2 different approaches to try to mitigate this non-CO₂ emission: the use of sustainable aviation fuel, for instance, and also the use of climate efficient trajectory, this eco trajectory that has been mentioned several times during the webinar. But if I want to conclude, aviation sustainability has many phases. It's noise, air quality, CO₂, and non-emission CO₂. And the aviation industry has to work on all these different dimensions. And it's already doing this. They are working on all these different dimensions. They are working on finding the best trade-off and compromises to be able to mitigate all these different impacts while becoming climate neutral by 2050 as required by the Green Deal. So it's quite challenging for us, but as it has been mentioned, we have to try it, we have to do it. There is no choice, by the way. Then the ITM community has the power to cut the climate impact of aviation. But of course, it requires collaborative and coordinated approach from the entire industry. And now I would like to thank our panelists for their amazing contribution today, and also you, the audience, for your very active participation. It's really nice to see so many questions. And again, I'm very sorry because we were short of time to address all these questions, but be sure that maybe we will have to do another webinar to address all these questions again. And stay tuned for our next webinar. We will have 3 other webinars that are already planned: the point merge, about intermodality and regional connectivity, and also about electrification at airport. So stay tuned, stay safe, and see you next time. Thank you.